Now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of frameworking and methods we use to operationalize open source in specific projects. So as I said, I'm both sides of the open source coin. On the top level or on the bottom level is that community groundswell sort of stuff. That was my background in it in particular, mainly through a foundation I set up in the open healthcare space, hence my question from early on. The Rapid Foundation, and we did loads of open 3D printed prosthetics in sub-Saharan Africa, South America, things like that. So real kind of cold face. We had no money. Legally, I have to say, we borrowed a 3D printer, but in reality, we just stole one from a research lab and sent it traveling around the world for a couple of years to do global development. And then during COVID as well, as somebody with significant experience in running remote open source hardware projects, we had lots to do during COVID. So, that really was the kind of foundation in that healthcare space. But on the other side of the coin, I do kind of more structured open source work, and that is under the remit of European funded research projects. So I don't know, anyone here worked with an EU funded research project before? One or two? Yeah, so they are a bureaucratic nightmare. They're the most political of anything. But in the context of this open source, that's amazing, because if they're happy with it, everyone else then ultimately will be happy with it. So in that, I do all of the commercialization and exploitation actions for these multi-million euro, multi-year funded R&D projects. And it's about bringing product to market or to deployment or to open source application. So in that ICP space, we do lots of projects. We've probably had 40, 50 funded EU projects over the years in a wide range of areas. And what we do in these things is all of the kind of commercial bits. Even if they're not actually commercial, the European Commission views them as commercial. Exploitation, innovation, that sort of stuff. So things like IP modeling, patent filing, open source repositories, open publications, open deployment, things like that. And we're multidisciplinary. We work across every space. We're industry space agnostic. We don't really care what the project is. We do the same stuff in all of them. So we kind of sit at that space of, we are a registered nonprofit, so it is nonprofit. We're a nonprofit partner. We do all of the commercial stuff, which gives us great flexibility, as in we can get into patents and IP and deployment, and then also open source and kind of open dissemination without any sort of commercial drive or interest in them, which is really kind of unique in this space. Where have we gone here?
You got it?
No. You got to click on the screen too.
I've got to click on the screen.
No.
There we go. Okay. Exactly. Yeah. So perfect. From experience in these things, and for our kind of North American colleagues as well, it broadly translates. If whatever were the important priorities in European funded projects are going to translate maybe into your own national government funded projects or industry funded projects. The issues that we see an awful lot is where this open research breaks in this kind of academic structure of real market-facing deployed products are in some kind of things like this. Project ends and repositories or data sets don't really have any long-term owners, so they fizzle out, are not updated, not held, not resourced. Licensing and IP decisions in these projects, it's kind of a dirty word entirely. People don't want to talk about them because they're horrendously complicated when you have national government multi-body agreements. So they leave conversations right to the very end, meaning it's a patch job, it's a poor representation, and so much gets missed in these because people just don't understand it. Any frameworks or methods might be published as a piece of academic literature, but never operationalized in any shape or form. Again, it's left too late and they don't have the actual operational infrastructure to do that. And industry interest in these projects generally arrives once the funding's gone. So the people are not motivated and don't have the actual capacity to continue developing. And then finally, things like OSPO's research support and innovation in these university partners generally operate completely separately, completely siloed. They don't talk to each other. And at best, at the very end of the project, the innovation support in a university had said, oh, we have this patent that we own. Maybe you might be able to open source elements of it. And it's just too late in the agreement. So in order to counteract that, we have been deploying, and again, this is a prototype, let's say, this is the foundational structure that I've been deploying in these research projects to try and make this a little bit easier. So I'll share a link to this to everyone. This literally is its first public appearance. It's been working in the background for a while, but we've been using it with our projects. It's basically the 4 elements of what we're calling in our side an open research stack. The things that are needed to continuate these projects in general. So when the project starts, you have funding, you have contributors, you have users and partners, your initial community. These are the bits that start pre-project. You know, who are your academics in it? Who are your industry partners? Who's your funding body? This happens at the minute. The foundations of the project are the things it makes, basically, the outputs, the software, the data, the frameworks, the methods, the technical solutions, the stuff the academics generate. That's the foundations. Governance then, you know, your ownership, your licensing, your IP, decision rights, collaborative business models, get layered on top. You have a sustainability element, and I don't mean environmental sustainability, I mean idea and innovation sustainability. You know, how's it going to be maintained? How is the continuity of funding look? Is there institutional support? Is there business models that are required to make these operational? And then the final bit, which is one of the most important bits we've seen, is a translation element, converting this from academic into industry or real world, because everyone speaks a completely different language. Investigating industry adoption, startups, procurement, standards, policy updates, the things that are co-associated, but completely out of the academic remit, that the main body of the partners in your projects don't care about because it's not in their space. And in some instances, there is no organization to do that. And ultimately, all of that will lead to your adoption and your impact, be it economic, societal, or environmental. So from the kind of 15, well, how did I say? Probably 40, 50 projects we've done so far. Most projects have these. They have some funder and community base, either in an academic institution or funded by a national body. All of them have foundations, so they're the technical or project outputs. Some of them have some governance infrastructure, but the higher up you get, the less and less likely they are to be present in these projects. Not many of them consider continuation and funding. Maybe it's an academic problem where you go from grant to grant to grant to grant to grant, and they don't really necessarily always continually flow between each other. And then translation, I say it as a lifetime academic, never ask an academic to translate anything into that you want to be understood by a real human being. They're not very good at that at all. And that's where it kind of falls down. So to give you a couple of examples, I closed a large European project just yesterday. We had our final project review meeting yesterday called 5G Timber, and this was in the kind of Northern European region to look at digitizing and integrating 5G as a carrier architecture for improvement in the Nordic timber industry. This project started as a direct result from Ukraine and Russia in order to disengage from Russian timber and wood and make the industry much more sustainable. So the project closed, it ran for 4 years. At the end of it, in the IP and developmental side, we had 25 indicated innovations that could lead to deployments or companies or spin-outs or integrations. We had 4 detailed end-stage business use cases, and we filed 7 patents over the project in total. In that, we had quite good governance structure, which was great. So, you know, our exploitation ambitions were managed and defined by me. So we were able to track it right from day one. That's all we did. We had structured IP strategy to make sure academics didn't accidentally disclose things we could protect later. And we also managed to identify the things that we were actively going to open source at the end of the project early on. So we didn't file anything in that space. And we had an ecosystem built around that then as well. For sustainability, we had an awful lot of outward positioning. We looked at market structures, we looked at clear commercial pathways for the technical business use cases. We had very detailed internal ownership and continuation models for specific assets in the project. And then we had, as I said, open source plans for other assets in general. And then our translation bit was directly engaged. So not just academic translation, but also business and economic translation. So we had it's called a Helix. It's a company based out of Ireland called Crowd Helix. They create focused communities online. So we had a European timber industry Helix. And in that, we had 129 experts from 93 organizations in 27 countries. And we made a load of contributions to standards in that space. So again, a nice kind of rounded, multifaceted project, only really delivered because we were involved as an actor from day one with a very clear structured plan with that open impact stack. The other side of the community, and this is the opposite side of that, during COVID, I ran a project called Team OSV. It was one of those global open source medical device actions, hence my question around risk, because we dealt with, honestly, horrendously complicated, horrendously serious risk during that time. And it was great. We had 3,000 volunteers working from 144 countries. We developed ventilator concepts. We were making healthcare systems, education systems, treatment systems, basically anything that was needed by the global healthcare community during COVID. We open sourced and shared nearly all of that sort of stuff. And the designs were fully open and fully open source from day one. So lots and lots of kind of open practices. What worked in it was very organic. The governance, the translation, the ownership emerged alongside creation, which in one way was good, but in a highly regulated space, it was an absolute nightmare. So you don't do that. We had direct hospital deployment with a super short turnaround phase. Now, again, I'll caveat that by saying during the COVID times, all bets were off for any healthcare regulation. You could do whatever you wanted. Not the way to have it, but from an open source side, great. You know, our solutions were being developed in one day, tested in the lab the second day, and the third day it was being field deployed with patients in Mexico or Costa Rica. You know, super fast turnaround cycles. That led to massively rapid iteration cycles with clinicians. The ideas got immediately in their hands. They said what worked, what didn't. And you got your feedback within hours in some cases versus months, days, weeks, years in some situations. What didn't work was it was chaos. It was insane. The world was crazy. There was no hierarchy. I had a friend of mine say we built an enterprise level organization overnight with no hierarchy and no structure. You don't want to do that ever. All this grey in my beard is directly from this project. It was very volunteer dependent. And in that, it meant we had some absolutely amazing volunteers, but we also had some that were super passionate but had no technical expertise or no history in a very regulated space. So we had a great team for CERN that did all of our simulation work, but equally we also had a guy who thought he could do simulation work in his bedroom, and they both took up the same level of bandwidth, even though they shouldn't have done that. So segregation of information, while open source is great and everyone's willing to contribute, all contributions aren't equal, unfortunately, in an awful lot of ways. And we did struggle with partitioning the time and, you know, dealing with that in practice. And then finally, long-term sustainability was unresolved. In this case, it didn't matter because we all hoped COVID would go away and all hoped we wouldn't need to use these healthcare interventions, which is how it actually turned out. But yeah, insight in that was translation happened during development, not after. You don't really want that to happen if you want to have specific end goals. We didn't. So if you're abiding by a grant or you've promised specific outcomes, you can't let these things happen during deployment. You do need to pre-plan them before you get there. So again, as I said, common failure patterns in both of them. Outputs created without ownership models, right? The ownership models are so unclear in these multi-partner, you know, European level funded projects. People just don't want to have the conversation. It's easier not to talk about it than have a conversation that you're not going to be able to answer. We could bring John from Trinity and the TTO from UCD in here and say, let's have that conversation. And they won't have that conversation with us because it's so nebulous. You kind of like, we'll deal with it if it comes up. Governance added late in project life cycles for continuation never really works. So people have already moved on. You know, they've moved on to the next grant, they've moved on to the next space, they've moved on to the next funding, but you've lost the majority of your partners. You need to get that governance early on with those structured models and get buy-in before they're distracted with the next proposal and the next project. Sustainability is regularly treated as future work. Oh, you know, when we finish the project, we'll talk about continuation. That never happens. You know, it doesn't. Project's over, forget about it, move on to the next one again. You need to think about, okay, what are we going to do? If what we're going to do is open source everything and disseminate the information at the end, one, you need to license it correctly, and then two, you actually have to disseminate it. There's no point in me saying, oh yeah, I've open sourced all of my project work for the last 5 years if it exists on my hard drive in my computer and nobody can get to it. Where does it go? Is it going to be hosted? Now that can be difficult. I fully open sourced my PhD from the day I wrote it, and it took me 6 months to get university approval from that in order to allow that to happen, just because it was unfamiliar to them. Translation, an awful lot relies on personal networks. So you translate to other people. I'll meet loads of people here and we'll work on the next stage of projects, and I'll say, I found this thing that you really like, so I sent it to you afterwards. But you have to have some motivation to exploit. And if you're an academic in a university and you're judged on the amount of grant funding you bring in, if this pathway is unclear, you're unlikely to do it. You know, it relies on the goodwill of individuals, and that's not always a reliable thing to lean on. And then finally, business models generally get explored only after technical completion. And that's not a good thing. So with the project I talked about in 5G Timber, I did all the business models of a 4-year project. I didn't get any real technical information until the end of year 3. So I don't know what I have to actually work with until you're 3/4 of the way through the project. And then I have to race to kind of catch up based on the progress of technical development. And that was with me being technically competent and educated to be able to follow the development. I still need to know what I have before I can build a plan for it. So, you know, it's great research assets, but in an awful lot of cases, super limited real world uptake. And again, anyone that's worked on European projects before would probably agree with that. It's a fact of these EU projects. Great input, but gets lost in that post-project dissemination phase. So again, you know, I'm of the belief that, you know, open research has to operate as a system from the very beginning. So, you know, you get OSPO or open research enablement from day one. You operate open practices, you have open community, you have open governance before the project begins, and that becomes the foundational structure of what you're doing. Research support needs to go with that and understand that. Your funding, your compliance, your project operations, they need to understand that these open elements are going to be in there and adapt for that as they go. And then your innovation and commercialization. Every university that gets funded has to cover this in some shape or form. And you have to be clear from the start. You know, who are you working with? Are there any IP? Is there startups? Is there adoption? You need to know what the university or funders are expecting before you build your plan to do it. If you are the most open source person in the world and want to open source the whole thing, if your funder and your university wants you to get patents or wants to spin out, you need to know that in the beginning. You can do both. You just need to plan for it from day one. So all three of these things need to align across this research impact stack. You need to try and cover all of these things, because if you do, it gives you the flexibility to move and grow in that space to wherever you need to do it. So 3 practical things that I suggest that people do, and in that case, all of them go towards increasing impact. Even if you're not going to continue or supply, it'll go to increasing impact. Number 1, design your governance from day one. Plan, discuss, plan again, things change. So licensing, ownership, IP, intellectual property, spin-outs, partnerships, repositories. Before your project starts, make that plan and discuss it. So you understand what everyone is expecting, and you can set your ground rules for deployment. You align your post-project stewardship explicitly in the beginning. Who is going to be in charge of this? Who in Stanford is going to be in charge of this post-project completion? Who do I send people to? How long are they going to be in charge of it? Where does the information go? Is it a person, a unit? Or are you going to offload it to somebody else and let them do it? If you do, give them the ownership of it. And then finally, build these translational pathways alongside research. So your communication dissemination starts from day one, but you actively do it. I'm of the belief that an academic paper is one of the worst forms to disseminate information known to man. They're impenetrable to read, they're completely ununderstandable, and nobody has access to them. So you need to make sure you communicate and disseminate to everybody. So that is me. I went on a bit over. No. Hopefully that helped a little bit. And, you know, as I said, one of the biggest recommendations I have is just work with somebody else who has worked in this space. Ask for input, ask for guidance, ask for whatever. I know with Inlecom, I do that constantly. We get inbounds from partners that say, you know, we're building this research proposal. Can you help us with our deployment plans or exploitation plans? The benefit of working for a nonprofit means we can relatively easily. We have quite a good portion of our time allocated to that. But ultimately then, with my business hat on, if you don't want to do any of this, bring on an external partner and just let them do it. But the majority of our projects, our partners love it when we come on as exploitation, commercialization, and dissemination partners. They just go, great, we don't want to answer any of these questions, you go and please do it. And we get involved in day one from the beginning. So, excellent.
Thank you very much, Colin. Really appreciate it.